The wind howled across the Montana plains, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain. Clint McGraw pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders, his calloused fingers gripping the worn leather of his reins. The town of Whitestone loomed ahead, its dim lanterns flickering like dying fireflies against the early evening haze. He had ridden this trail countless times before, but something gnawed at his gut tonight, a quiet unease, the kind of man who had seen war never ignored. The McGraw Ranch lay just beyond the ridge, nestled between the rolling hills and the dense forests that stretched toward the distant Rockies. It wasn't much, but it was home, a patch of land wrestled from the wild, built with sweat and grit, a place where he and Eleanor had carved out a future. She had always believed in the dream more than he had, her hands planting seeds where he only saw dust. He shifted in his saddle, his mind flickering back to the conversation he'd had in town. Silas Kane. The name was a curse on the frontier, spoken in saloons with a careful hush, in whispers between men who had seen what happened when you crossed him. Kane and his men had arrived in Whitestone a month back, their pockets lined with stolen gold and their eyes set on land that wasn't theirs. They had already taken 3 homesteads, the families gone without a trace. When Kane had approached Clint that afternoon, offering to buy his land for a laughable sum, Clint had known what it meant. It wasn't an offer. It was a warning. He had met Kane's dark gaze across the saloon table and said the only thing a man with a spine could say. No. The ride home was long, the kind that gave a man too much time to think. He pushed the mare harder as the first drops of rain struck his hat. The house came into view, its modest frame standing against the storm's growing fury. A single lantern burned in the window. Eleanor always left it for him, a small gesture, but one that told him she was waiting. But something was wrong. The air felt still, too still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The usual sounds of the ranch, horses shifting in the corral, the distant howl of a coyote, were absent. Even the wind had stilled. Clint slowed his horse, his hand instinctively resting on the revolver at his hip. Then he saw the door, hanging open, swaying on broken hinges. His stomach turned to stone. He swung out of the saddle, his boots hitting the wet earth with a dull thud. The mud swallowed the sound, but he barely noticed. His pulse pounded in his ears. Inside, the house was dark, except for the dying glow of the lantern. Furniture lay overturned, the wooden table shattered, the scent of gunpowder still clinging to the air. Eleanor? His voice barely carried. No answer. His breath came faster now, uneven, his chest tightening like a vice. He moved deeper into the house, past the broken dishes, past the splintered chair where Eleanor had sat that morning, laughing as she braided her hair. Then he saw it, a message, carved into the wooden beam above the fireplace. This is what happens when you say no. His knees nearly buckled. Blood stained the floor. Not much. Not enough to mean death, but enough to make his vision go red. They had taken her. Clint's fingers curled into fists, so tight his knuckles cracked. The world shrank to a single, burning thought. Silas Kane had made a mistake. A storm rumbled in the distance, echoing the rage rising in his chest. His hand went to the rifle by the door, his father's Winchester. It felt right in his grip, the weight familiar, the cold steel matching the ice now settling in his veins. A trail. He needed a trail. Outside, the rain had started to fall in earnest, but not enough to wash away the tracks. Hoofprints, deep and uneven, leading north. At least half a dozen riders moving fast. Clint grabbed a saddlebag, stuffing it with bullets, jerky, anything he could find. He paused only once, his fingers brushing against Eleanor's shawl, still draped over the chair by the hearth. He clenched his jaw and pulled it from its resting place, tucking it inside his coat. Then he stepped back out into the night, into the storm, into the hunt. And God helped the men who had taken his wife. The rain had turned the earth into thick, clinging mud, making each hoofbeat a struggle. Clint urged his mare forward, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, his thoughts a relentless storm. The tracks were fresh, barely softened by the downpour. 6 riders, maybe 7, pushing hard through the valley, their path winding toward the foothills. Cain was running, but he wasn't running scared. He was leading Clint into the wild, into places where the law held no weight. Clint welcomed it. He didn't need law. He needed vengeance. Lightning split the sky, throwing jagged shadows across the land. He felt the weight of his rifle strapped across his back, the cold steel pressing against his spine. The revolver at his hip was loaded, each bullet a promise. He had no illusions about what lay ahead. Men like Cain didn't leave loose ends. If Eleanor was still alive, it was because Cain wanted her to be. For now, his grip tightened on the reins. He pushed the horse faster. The trees thickened as he rode deeper into the valley, the scent of wet pine sharp in the cold air. The trail was easy to follow. Cain's men weren't hiding their path. They thought they had time, thought no man would be reckless enough to come after them alone. They were wrong. A shape loomed ahead, a crumpled wagon, one wheel shattered, its canvas ripped and flapping in the wind. Clint slowed, his breath steady, his senses reaching for anything out of place. A dead horse lay nearby, its body still warm, steam rising where rain met flesh. The wagon had been attacked, but not by Cain's men. A low growl carried through the trees. Clint dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He moved slow, rifle ready. Blood streaked the ground, leading away from the wreckage. He followed it step by careful step until he saw the body. A traitor, his throat torn open, eyes wide in frozen terror. Something had killed him, something with teeth. The second growl came from the shadows. Clint turned just as the mountain lion sprang. Instinct took over. He fired before he could think, the shot cracking through the storm. The bullet struck the beast's shoulder, knocking it mid-leap. It hit the ground hard, snarling, its amber eyes burning with rage. Clint stepped back, cocking the rifle, ready to fire again, but the cat hesitated, muscles coiling as it calculated whether this fight was worth finishing. Blood dripped from its side, staining the earth dark. With a final snarl, it turned and vanished into the trees. Clint exhaled, lowering his rifle. He didn't linger. The dead man was beyond saving, and Eleanor was still out there. He remounted, spurring the horse forward. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the wind had picked up, carrying whispers through the trees. He followed the trail deeper into the wilderness, his mind sharpening with each mile. Hours passed. The sky darkened, and the weight of exhaustion pulled at his bones. He needed to rest, but rest meant time lost, and time lost meant Eleanor slipping further away. He forced himself on, through ravines and across shallow rivers, until a faint glow flickered ahead. A fire. He slid from the saddle, tying his mare to a low branch. He moved forward on foot, his steps near silent, his breath steady. The fire burned low, a small camp tucked against the cliffs. 2 men sat near the flames, their voices low, their rifles resting within easy reach. One of them turned slightly, and the firelight caught his face. Clint recognized him. He was one of Cain's men, one of the bastards who had laughed in Whitestone, who had stood behind Cain when the offer was made. Clint's fingers curled around the handle of his revolver. He stepped into the firelight. Both men looked up. Their hands moved toward their weapons, but Clint was faster. The first shot took the closest man in the chest, knocking him backward into the dirt. The second reached for his rifle, but Clint was on him before he could lift it. He slammed his fist into the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. The outlaw coughed, spitting blood into the dirt. "McGraw," he gasped, eyes wild with disbelief. Clint crouched, pressing the barrel of his revolver against the man's forehead. "Where is she?" The outlaw swallowed hard. "You're dead, rancher. Cain's gonna gut you." Clint pressed the gun harder. "Where?" The man gritted his teeth, but fear flickered behind his eyes. He was young, barely more than a boy, and boys made mistakes. The canyon, he spat. North. He's talking her to the old trading post. Clint didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The body slumped against the earth, steam rising from the blood pooling in the cold air. He didn't waste time searching them. He had what he needed. The old trading post. It was an abandoned fortress built into the cliffs, a relic from a time when men still believed they could tame the frontier with wood and stone. It was a place men went to disappear, a place where the wind carried secrets, and screams faded before they reached the open air. Clint had been there once before, and soon he'd be there again. He turned, striding back toward his horse. The storm had passed, but the sky remained heavy, the moon casting pale light across the land. He mounted, his body aching, his mind set. Kane thought this was over. He thought wrong. The river was a black serpent winding through the valley, its waters swollen from the storm. Clint pulled his horse to a stop at the bank, his breath steady, but his body aching from the hard ride. The canyon wasn't far now, another half-day's push, but Kane's men had a lead, and the river was the only thing between him and the shortest route. The tracks led straight to the water's edge, disappearing into the current. They had crossed. The night was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, the wind whispering through the trees. Clint swung down from the saddle, testing the ground. The river ran deep, faster than he liked, but there was no time to search for a safer crossing. He unfastened his rifle, slinging it across his back, and pulled the saddlebag tighter against the mare's side. With a click of his tongue, he urged her forward. The water bit like ice, wrapping around his legs as the mare took careful steps, muscles straining against the current. Clint gritted his teeth, gripping the reins tight as the river pulled at them. The horse fought for footing, hooves slipping against the unseen rocks below. Halfway across, the current caught them hard, dragging them sideways. Clint kicked free from the saddle just before the mare lost her footing completely. The water swallowed him, slamming his body against the current, his rifle twisting on its strap. He surfaced, gasping, his fingers clawing for something, anything, to hold onto. The river didn't care. It was stronger, colder. It wanted to pull him under. His boots scraped against stone. He twisted, forcing himself toward the shallows, every muscle burning with effort. His fingers found purchase on a jagged rock, and he hauled himself forward, coughing out river water. His mare was nearby, scrambling onto the muddy bank, trembling but unharmed. Clint lay there for a moment, the night sky spinning above him, his breath ragged. Then he rolled to his knees, shivering, pushing himself upright. He couldn't afford to stop. He climbed back into the saddle, his body numb with cold, and spurred the horse forward. The canyon walls loomed ahead, rising like giants from the earth. The wind funneled through the narrow pass, carrying a silence that felt too heavy, too expectant. He slowed his pace, eyes scanning the ridges above. It was a perfect place for an ambush. A branch snapped. Clint didn't think. He dove from the saddle a second before the gunshot cracked through the night. His mare reared, screaming, bolting into the darkness. Clint hit the ground hard, rolling behind a boulder as another shot rang out, ricocheting off stone. He drew his revolver, breath steady despite the pounding in his chest. His wet clothes clung to his skin, the cold a dull ache now. He listened. One shot. Two. The bastard wasn't alone. A voice carried through the canyon. "Come on out, McGraw. No need to die tired." Clint exhaled, shifting against a rock. He had the high ground against him, fewer bullets, and no way to flank without exposing himself. He needed something else. He picked up a loose stone, weighed it in his hand. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he sent it tumbling down the opposite ridge. The moment it clattered against the rock, a gunman fired. That was all Clint needed. He pivoted, rising just enough to squeeze the trigger. His bullet found flesh. A scream. A body tumbling down the slope, landing hard in the dust. One down. The second man hesitated. Clint could hear the shift of boots against rock, the way the wind caught on labored breathing. He had him now. He rolled out, fired once. The last outlaw crumpled, the gun slipping from his fingers before he even hit the ground. Clint stayed low, waiting, listening. The wind carried nothing but the sound of his own breathing. It was over. He moved to the bodies, kicking away their weapons. Young men. Boys, really. Too stupid or too desperate to know they were already dead when they rode with Cain. He had no sympathy. He collected his horse where she had fled, whispering to calm her, then rode on, deeper into the canyon. The old trading post wasn't far now. The land grew harsher, jagged rock giving way to dry scrub and brittle grass. The scent of smoke reached him first, a thin wisp curling against the night sky. He dismounted, moving on foot now, sticking to the shadows. The trading post was carved into the cliffs, half built from stone, half from rotting timber. It had once been a place of commerce, a stop for weary travelers. Now it was something else. A prison. He crept closer, pressing himself against the rock. Two men stood near the entrance, rifles in hand, laughing low over some private joke. Another paced near the corral, his boots kicking up dust. Clint counted at least 5 others, their voices drifting from inside. And then he heard her. Eleanor. The sound of her voice, strained but defiant, cut through the night like a blade. Clint closed his eyes, breathing through the surge of rage that threatened to take him. He couldn't go in wild. He needed to be smart. He unfastened his knife, testing the weight in his hand. 1 breath. 2. Then he moved. The man near the corral never saw him coming. Clint's hand clamped over his mouth as the blade slipped between his ribs, quick and clean. He lowered the body soundlessly, his pulse steady. 1 down. He melted into the shadows, moving like a wolf through tall grass. The 2 at the entrance were next. They never even turned. The wind slithered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sweat, smoke, and something darker. Something that made Clint's grip tighten around the revolver in his hand. The trading post loomed ahead, its crumbling timbers swallowed in the shadows of the cliffs. He counted the men again. 5 outside, maybe more inside. Somewhere in that rotting husk of a building, Eleanor was waiting. Alive. She had to be. He moved like a shadow, silent as the wind that whispered through the stone. The man closest to him stood near the entrance, shifting his weight, muttering something about the cold. Clint struck fast, a brutal, practiced motion. A knife to the throat, a firm hand over the mouth to smother the gurgle of dying breath. The body slumped against the dust, lifeless. 1 down. The next 2 were talking, their laughter jagged and mean. Clint slid behind a stack of crates, waited for the right moment. The taller one spat into the dirt, rubbing his hands together for warmth. I say we kill her in the morning, he said. Cain don't need her. Just needs McGraw to know she died slow. Clint saw red. He stepped out, quick and precise, raising the revolver. The first shot hit the talker between the eyes before his mouth could even form the next word. The second turned, barely registering what had happened before Clint's second shot sent him staggering backward. He collapsed with a wet thud, dust rising from where his body met the earth. 3 down. The 4th came running from the side, gun drawn. But Clint was faster. He pivoted, fired, and the outlaw tumbled into the dirt, his weapon clattering uselessly beside him. 4. The 5th had seen enough. Nope, he gasped, dropping his rifle and bolting toward the horses. Clint let him go. He wasn't here for nameless gunmen. He was here for Cain. The trading post stood silent now, the air thick with the scent of blood and gunpowder. Clint took a breath, then another, steadying himself. The door loomed ahead, slightly ajar, light flickering within. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Inside, the place stank of old wood, stale whiskey, and sweat. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting long, shifting shadows. Eleanor sat against a support beam, her wrists bound, her dress torn and dirt-streaked, but her eyes, those fierce, unbroken eyes, locked onto his the moment he stepped inside. Clint. Her voice was hoarse, but strong. Relief hit him like a bullet to the chest, nearly staggering him. She was alive. Before he could take another step, a slow, deliberate clap echoed through the room. Silas Kane stepped from the darkness. "Well, hell," he drawled, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Look what the storm dragged in." He looked the same as he had in Whitestone, lean, wolfish, a man with a face carved from trouble. His black duster swayed as he moved, hand hovering near the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. "You made quite the mess out there, McGraw," Kane said. "Killed a lot of my men." Clint didn't respond. He only took another step closer to Eleanor. Kane clicked his tongue. Not yet." A shape shifted in the corner, another outlaw, gun in hand, half hidden in the shadows. Kane still had backup. Clint cursed himself for not checking. "Here's how this goes," Kane continued, voice smooth, practiced. "You drop that iron and I let her live." Clint didn't move. "Come on, McGraw. I know your kind. The righteous ones. The ones who think grit and good hearts can change this world." Kane tilted his head. "They don't. They just die slower." Clint inhaled, exhaled, felt the weight of every choice he'd ever made press against his ribs. Then, slowly, he crouched, setting his revolver on the wooden floor. Kane grinned, the expression slick and satisfied. "That's a good man." Clint met Eleanor's eyes. Then he moved. In a single motion, he grabbed the revolver from the fallen outlaw behind him, spun and fired. The hidden gunman barely had time to flinch before the bullet took him in the chest, sending him sprawling. Kane cursed, drawing his gun, but Clint was already moving. The world slowed. Clint saw it all. The flicker of firelight against Kane's revolver, the tightening of his jaw, the twitch in his shoulder just before he fired. Clint was faster. The shot rang out like thunder in a dry valley. Kane staggered, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. He coughed, a bitter smile on his lips as he swayed, his grip loosening on the revolver before it tumbled from his fingers. "Well, hell," he muttered again, voice rasping. "Guess you do got the devil in you." He fell. Silence swallowed the room. Clint stood there, his breath sharp in the stillness, watching as Kane's body stilled against the bloodstained wood. Then, finally, he turned to Eleanor. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees, fingers working fast to untie the ropes binding her wrists. The moment she was free, she collapsed into his arms, shaking but solid, her breath warm against his neck. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Clint pressed his forehead against hers. "Always?" Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the world had gone quiet. Kane was dead, and Clint McGraw had won.